Imagine spending your entire life believing you know exactly where you come from. Your family name, your ancestors, your homeland. All of it confirmed by centuries of records, stories, and tradition. Now imagine scientists crack open the oldest graves on your island, and everything your culture told you about itself turns out to be only half the story. That's not a plot from a thriller novel. That's Iceland. And when ancient DNA finally told the truth that 1,000 years of written history refused to, the result was one of the most jaw-dropping genetic discoveries of the modern era. Let's start with what everyone believed for over a millennium. When Iceland was settled, around 870 CE, the story was airtight. Bold Norse chieftains, fed up with a power-hungry king back in Norway, packed up their ships and sailed west into the unknown. They found a wild, volcanic island, empty, untamed, and ready to be claimed. They built farms, forged laws, and eventually created the world's oldest surviving parliament. A medieval record called the Book of Settlements documented roughly 435 principal settlers by name. Almost all of them Norwegian, Scandinavian names, Scandinavian fathers, Scandinavian blood. Clean, simple, definitive. And the evidence backed it up. The Icelandic language, even today, is the closest living tongue to Old Norse, so preserved that modern Icelanders can actually read medieval Viking texts without a translation guide. The legal traditions, the mythology, the shipbuilding, all of it pointed straight back to Scandinavia. Historians looked at this mountain of evidence and said, case closed. Iceland is a Norse colony, full stop. But here's the thing about airtight cases. Sometimes there's a crack you've been ignoring the whole time. Tucked into the sagas, those epic Norse narratives everyone treated as gospel, were these odd little mentions. References to Irish monks who were already on the island when the Norse arrived. Women described as coming from the west. Figures with Gaelic names who just appeared, with no backstory, no explanation. The Book of Settlements itself acknowledged a handful of settlers from Ireland and Scotland, but treated them like footnotes. Exceptions to the real story. Nobody pushed on those cracks, because the written record was so loud, so confident, and so Norse. Then came genetics. And genetics doesn't care about narratives. In the early 2000s, researchers at a genetics lab in Reykjavik began analyzing mitochondrial DNA from modern Icelanders. Now, mitochondrial DNA is special. It passes only through the maternal line. Mother to daughter to granddaughter, an unbroken genetic chain reaching back through the centuries. The team sequenced over 1,600 samples from across the island. What they found stopped them cold. Nearly 37% of the maternal lineages in modern Iceland didn't come from Scandinavia at all. They traced back to Ireland and Scotland. Almost 4 in every 10 Icelandic women alive today carry Gaelic ancestry on their mother's side. The Y chromosome data, which tracks the paternal line, told a related but lopsided story. About 75% Scandinavian on the father's side, 25% Gaelic. So the pattern was clear: Norse men, Gaelic women. And the most uncomfortable implication hanging over that discovery? A large number of those women were almost certainly enslaved. Viking raids on the Irish and Scottish coasts are among the most thoroughly documented events of the early medieval period. Starting around 795 CE, Norse warriors hit coastal monasteries and villages with terrifying regularity. Dublin itself was founded as a Norse trading hub, and a significant chunk of its economy ran on the sale of captured people. Irish chronicles recorded these raids with grim, unflinching precision. Some Gaelic women may have come willingly, wives or partners from the Norse-Gaelic hybrid communities that had formed over generations in places like the Hebrides, Orkney, and the Isle of Man. But either way, the founding population of Iceland was not the pure Norse story anyone had been telling. Not even close. And yet, and this is where it gets complicated, critics had a fair point to make. Mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes each only track one line of descent, one thread in a massive tapestry. In a small, isolated island population, random genetic drift over 1,000 years could easily distort those single lineage signals. Maybe, the skeptics said, the Gaelic signal in modern Icelanders was just a statistical artifact. Maybe the founders really were overwhelmingly Norse, and randomness had blown a minor detail out of proportion. To settle that debate once and for all, you'd need to do something far harder. You'd need DNA from the founders themselves. In 2018, that's exactly what a team of scientists achieved. Working with ancient remains from burial sites scattered across Iceland, they extracted and sequenced whole genomes, not fragments, not single lineages, but complete genetic blueprints from 27 ancient Icelanders. These weren't random medieval bodies. Radiocarbon dating placed them between approximately 870 and 1000 CE. These were the founders, the first generation and their immediate descendants, the people who built the very first farms on that volcanic rock. Picture the lab: bone fragments, some barely bigger than a coin, carefully drilled under sterile conditions. Scientists coaxing degraded strands of ancient DNA from material over 1,000 years old. Each recovered genome then cross-referenced against thousands of modern Scandinavian and British-Irish reference samples. One by one, the genetic profiles assembled. Some ancient Icelanders clustered neatly with Scandinavian populations. Others clustered with British-Irish groups, and some sat squarely in between, admixed individuals whose parents or grandparents had come from both worlds. When the full picture came into focus, it didn't just challenge the narrative. It flipped it. The founding population of Iceland was not 75% Norse. It wasn't even 60% Norse. It was approximately 50-50, half Scandinavian, half Gaelic. The Gaelic contribution to Iceland's founding gene pool was dramatically larger than anyone, even the researchers themselves, had predicted. Now hold on, because the next detail is the one that genuinely messes with your head. The founders were about half Gaelic. Modern Icelanders are only about a third Gaelic on the maternal side and a quarter on the paternal side. Over 1,100 years, the Gaelic signal didn't stay the same. It shrank. The island started out evenly split, and over 45 generations, it drifted toward Scandinavia. Not because new Scandinavians moved in, but because of the brutal mathematics of small, isolated populations. Here's how that works. In a founding population of somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people, randomness has enormous power. A few families have slightly more children who survive. A plague hits one district harder than another. A brutal winter wipes out an entire coastal settlement. Over generations, these random events compound. Certain lineages multiply, others quietly vanish. The Laki volcanic eruption of 1783 alone killed roughly a quarter of Iceland's entire population and half its livestock in a single catastrophe. Every disaster like that reshuffled the genetic deck. Families who happened to survive passed their ancestry forward. Those who didn't were permanently erased from the gene pool. Iceland didn't become more Scandinavian because of culture or preference. It became more Scandinavian because the Gaelic founders who left the most surviving descendants happened to be the ones whose lines persisted through centuries of fire, plague, and famine. And if you needed any more confirmation, it arrived in 2021 from a completely different direction. A separate research team analyzed the three-dimensional shape of the skull base, what scientists call basicranial morphology, from early Icelandic skeletal remains. Skull-base geometry is highly heritable. It reflects population ancestry in ways that diet, climate, and lifestyle simply cannot alter. Their conclusion matched the DNA perfectly. The early Icelandic skulls were intermediate between Scandinavian and British-Irish populations. Different method, same answer. Now, the debate isn't fully closed. Some researchers argue that not all the Gaelic founders were enslaved. By the time Iceland's settlement began, Norse Gaelic communities had existed for generations across the northern islands of Britain. Intermarriage was common. People who sailed to Iceland may have spoken Norse, identified as Norse, and thought of themselves as Norse, while still carrying Gaelic DNA from grandparents they barely remembered. Culture and genetics are not the same thing, and they don't always move together. Others push back on that firmly. The female skew in the Gaelic signal is specific and hard to explain away. If Gaelic men and women had migrated freely and equally, you'd expect roughly balanced maternal and paternal Gaelic contributions. You don't get that. The maternal signal is dramatically stronger. And the slave trade in the Viking Age was not some fringe activity. It was central to the Norse economy. The annals of medieval Ireland didn't just mention it. They documented it raid by raid, year by year, with names and places. That asymmetry in the data points in one direction, and it's uncomfortable. But here's the tension that ancient DNA cannot resolve on its own. Genes carry ancestry. They don't carry biography. A genome can tell you that a woman buried in a 10th century Icelandic grave had Irish ancestors. It cannot tell you whether she chose to get on that ship, whether anyone asked her, or what her life looked like once she arrived. The science gives us the what, the why, and the human story behind it exists mostly in silence now. Silence where real lives should be. Think about what the sagas are, really. They're one of the most celebrated bodies of literature in medieval history. Epic tales of settlement, conflict, law, and adventure. They preserved Norse names, Norse deeds, Norse heroes. They were written by a society that had, within just a few generations, already begun to forget, or perhaps chose not to remember, that nearly half of its own ancestry came from somewhere else. The Irish and Scottish women who helped found Iceland left almost nothing in those pages. No sagas bear their names. No laws credit their presence. The civilization they helped build quietly rewrote itself as something pure, something more singular, something more Norse. And yet they left something the sagas couldn't erase. They left it in the DNA, in the 27 genomes recovered from those ancient graves, in the mitochondrial lineages still present in Icelandic women today, in the shape of ancient skulls sitting in museum collections. The Irish and Scottish women who crossed the North Atlantic, whether they chose to or not, are written into the biological foundation of an entire civilization. A civilization that spent 1,000 years telling a different story about itself. The world's oldest parliament. The language closest to Old Norse. The culture that preserved the Eddas and the sagas for all of human history. All of it built by a founding population that was as much Gaelic as it was Scandinavian. That is not a footnote. That is the story. So here's the question this leaves us with. If nearly half of Iceland's founders were Gaelic, and the written record barely breathed a word about them, how many other founding stories around the world are waiting for ancient DNA to finally set the record straight? How many civilizations have told themselves a cleaner, simpler origin story than the one their own bones would tell? Iceland is just one island. The science is just getting started. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you as much as it fascinates us, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Because we're just scratching the surface of what ancient DNA is revealing about who we really are and where we actually came from. The truth is almost always more interesting than the legend. And the legends, it turns out, have a lot to answer for.